Five friends are hanging out in a house on Birchwood Drive in Wichita in the year 2000. Temperatures outside are freezing and there is snow on the ground everywhere. The door bursts open as two men force their way into the house. What happens next will be named in the media as the Wichita Massacre or Wichita Horror. So this is going to go a little differently than what I normally cover. I know I've been covering like horror matter, like cryptids and mysteries and stuff. This one obviously is going to be different. So let's just go ahead and jump into that. Reginald and Jonathan Carr were born in Dodge City, Kansas to Janice Harding. Reginald, the elder brother, was born on the 14th of November, 1977, and Jonathan on March 30th, 1980. They also had an older sister. Their upbringing was not really an easy one, where their parents would often argue, sometimes degenerating into physical violence on both sides. The parents would end up divorcing, and the boy's father would then leave the family, never to come back. What a chode. It is alleged that their older sister suffered abuse at the hands of their father and then subsequently some of the mother's boyfriends. While their mother ended up remarrying, there were similar instances of violence in the home, with the new husband pointing a handheld at her head at one point and the boys suffering physical violence at both her hand and the new husband's. The boys would also live with their grandmother on occasion, but this would not be any more of a stable environment than what they were used to being subjected to. She too was prone to bouts of rage and violence. They would see anger, alcohol abuse, and drug use regularly throughout their childhood. All of this combined for a very tumultuous and troubled upbringing, and one that fairly quickly presented itself in behavioral problems for the two boys. Reginald, the older brother, was a poor student in school, often getting into fights and becoming active in the horizontal way at a young age and involved in drugs. His younger brother, Jonathan, would have a similarly turbulent youth. He would suffer from poor mental health, becoming extremely depressed, and would attempt to end himself at the age of 16 by drinking some antifreeze. Reginald was extremely protective of his brother, especially when they were young, and would defend him whenever required. As they transitioned from young adulthood, trouble with the law became commonplace, particularly with Reginald, as he began to rack up arrests, and also just in general, he was well recognized by any police or law enforcement that would come by. Jonathan, too, had a string of arrests for various crimes. Reginald would then marry a number of times, but each of these marriages would end up in failure. It is the year 2000, and the Carr brothers embark on a crime spree in Wichita, one that will only escalate as it progresses and result in the loss of multiple lives before it is over. To this day, there is no clear motive or even a trigger for this. When they arrive, their first crime that they commit is on the 8th of December, where they pull a handheld on a 23-year-old assistant baseball coach named Andrew Schreiber and then rob him. 3 days later, on the 11th of December, a 55-year-old librarian named Ann Walenta was parking in front of her house when she was approached by the brothers brandishing their weapons. She attempted to flee in her vehicle, but they opened fire and she is then hit. When she slumps forward, her head hits the car horn, which sounds constantly. A neighbor is then alerted by the sound and sees the situation, calling the authorities. The bullet injuries that she suffered have paralyzed her, unfortunately. Ann Walenta is rushed to the hospital, but will later succumb from the gunshot wounds 3 weeks later. Another 3 days passed before the Carr brothers would strike again on the 14th of December. This time, they forced their way into an address on Birchwood Drive with 5 people inside. The two brothers are armed with both handguns and golf clubs. Two 25-year-old women named Holly G. and Heather Mueller, and 3 men aged between 26 to 29 named Aaron Sander, Brad Haka, and Jason Beaufort. They hold them at gunpoint and then proceed to ransack the house, stripping it of all valuables. Once they have taken all the items that they could, they then return to the victims and then subject them to various forms of certain type of abuse. Also, the woman named Holly G, or HG as she said in some articles, it's there to basically protect her identity. They forced the male participants to engage in these horrific acts with the females that were in the house. They also actively participated in this themselves with the women. From here, it just kind of gets darker and darker, so we'll just move along. They then ended up beating them with the golf clubs that they had brought with them to basically be used for this purpose. The people in the house were abused and terrorized for hours in total, suffering all imaginable forms of indignity. The captives are then forced into the vehicle and taken to a bank, where they are made to empty their accounts and then hand over the money to the Carr brothers. A total of around $2,000 is withdrawn. They eventually drive onto a soccer field where the 5 victims were each domed to get rid of anybody that may have, wanted to say anything about it. The brothers then drive over the bodies as they leave deliberately. Reginald and Jonathan return to the house on Birchwood Drive to rob it further, seeking out anything of value that maybe they had missed the first time. As well as all the cash and valuables, they had also stolen an engagement ring that Jason was intending to use to propose to Holly, one of the other victims. At this point, they also take out the dog named Nikki that was present in the house, and then they also steal Jason's truck. Look, I'm just gonna break in for a second. First off, don't even waste tax dollars on these guys. Just go ahead and dome them as soon as you see it. Burn a clip in them on principle for real. This is, again, I kind of say this in my other videos, but it holds true with everything. Cops, while it's important to call them for specific events, like if you're in a non-threatening situation, or you can actually wait for the cops, I guess the best way to put it, you are always going to be your first line of defense. And I'm not saying that what happened with these people, they didn't defend themselves or anything, but it's like, for instance, I hide countermeasures around the house in case, something were to happen. Somebody breaks in and I'm in the other room. It's like, okay, well, we're on equal footing here because I got something that can take care of you. You probably have something that can take care of me. It is what it is. But the point is that this is why you need to have something you can defend yourself in your home. You are your first line of defense. And unfortunately, the human race is still very violent. We are in one of the most peaceful times in history, but that doesn't mean individually people aren't like this. I can't stand injustice like this. It actually genuinely makes me angry. But that's the whole thing is, again, just burn a clip in these guys. This is moving on. But what the Carr brothers don't realize is that while 4 of their 5 gunshot victims have succumbed to their wounds, Holly actually survived. The bullet that she was shot with hit the beret that she was wearing in her hair and had been deflected just enough to not kill her. In the freezing snow and having been stripped of all her clothes by the brothers for their various assaults, she makes her way to the nearest house almost a mile away, and the residents take her in and then contact the relevant authorities. The story of robbery, assault, and the 4 murders is immediate headline news, and the authorities are on the lookout for any information that can lead to the arrest of the suspects. The story is reported on every news station in the local area. Local residents watching the news story see the report on Jason's vehicle that was taken by the perpetrators and then contact the authorities to let them know they have seen a similar truck parked outside of the apartment complex. When the police investigate, another neighbor remembers helping someone carry a TV from that specific truck into their apartment. Authorities then enter the apartment where they find and arrest Reginald Carr. Jonathan Carr is then arrested shortly after. He was staying with his girlfriend, and her mother found the engagement ring that the brother stole from Jason and then phones the police about it. They arrive at the home, and although he makes a break for it, the younger brother Carr is arrested after a brief chase. Reginald and Jonathan are then taken into custody, where they are positively identified in a number of ways. Firstly, Andrew Schreiber, the baseball coach that they had robbed, is brought in and identifies them as the 2 that were responsible for the gunpoint robbery. And Walenta, the woman who was shot inside of her vehicle, is also able to identify both criminals before she passes away from her wounds. Reginald and Jonathan Carr are charged with a slew of offenses, multiple murder counts, and aggravated kidnapping, assault, robbery, and animal cruelty, basically for taking out the dog. The coverage of the crimes and the aftermath shocks both the community and further afield as the brutality of their actions becomes known. When they eventually go to trial, there is a multitude of evidence presented against them, and really not much doubt that the prosecutors have the men responsible. As well as all the eyewitness testimony and Andrew Schreiber and the positive IDs from his own robbery, as well as Ann Walenta's identification prior to her passing, there were multiple other witnesses called. When the evidence was being presented in court about the shooting of Ann Walenta, one of the jury members fainted at the graphic depictions and had to be taken to the hospital to be checked over. Blame it on the brothers as well. Evidence also showed up that after shooting their victims on the soccer field, the brothers deliberately drove over their bodies as they were fleeing in the vehicle. Holly G., whose full name was never given at the time to protect her identity as a victim of this crime, testified about what happened to not only her but her fiance and their friends that day at the hands of the Carr brothers. Much of what was described was graphic, extreme, and upsetting to the jury and those following the trial. There were a total of 97 witnesses called to the stand, and the trial dragged on for just under 2 months. Although the Carr brothers are African American and the shooting victims were all white, prosecutors declined the charge of basically calling it a hate crime, believing that the race of the people involved was not a motivating factor. This then caused a small amount of controversy on both sides, as some believed that this was some sort of double standard where it would have been approached differently had the races been reversed. Similarly, others pointed to the fact that 4 black people had been killed only 8 days before the Wichita massacre, and it had received far less media coverage. Some question why there was such disparity between the extent of the coverage and the outrage between the 2 crimes despite their many similarities. In the end, it was unlikely to have any significant impact on the outcome or the sentencing, as if they were found guilty, it was likely to be a death sentence for the Carr brothers either way. At one point, Reginald and Jonathan's mother, Janice, made a statement to the court, initially addressing her sons. "I don't know what went wrong, but I love you. I love both of you." She then would go on to speak to the rest of the court. "And I'm sorry for everything that happened, and if I did something wrong, I am sorry. I'd just like to say I am sorry to everyone. I don't know if this is my fault. If it was, I am just sorry. Sorry." The lawyers representing each of the brothers appealed for clemency on their behalf, with Reginald's lawyers asking the court for mercy, which was not extended to the 4 individuals, referring to the victims from Birchwood Drive that were murdered. Among those various defenses presented, the Carr brothers' representatives showed evidence that Reginald was brain damaged and that through a rough upbringing, this affected their development. They would go on to point to the chaotic and often violent living situations the brothers endured and their exposure to things like drugs and horizontal positions from ages that were far too young. The attorney for Jonathan then pointed to the fact that unlike his brother, he had no previous serious criminal involvement prior to the crime spree and believed that he was unduly influenced by his older brother. He did have previous arrests, but his defense argued that Reginald was the only one who had been previously incarcerated and had more serious cases on his rap sheet. My God, what a defense. Like, look, I get it. Lawyers have to do what lawyers have to do. Everybody is entitled to representation, but good God. Anyways, they pointed to Jonathan's struggle with depression, mentioning not only his attempt on his own life at the age of 16 when Reginald went to prison, but also an alleged earlier attempt at the age of 7. Describing the home life of the 2 accused, he said the following: "This was a very dysfunctional family. They fought, they drank, they drugged up in front of the kids." The prosecution sought the death penalty, and amongst the evidence presented, they were attempting to show that the crime was premeditated, cold-blooded, and intentional in every way, which, look man, from my layman's perspective, yeah, it definitely was. Alongside the brutal nature of what occurred that day and the multiple separate instances of wanton violence, they showed that the brothers running over the bodies of the victims demonstrated a callousness and a wish to not be discovered. Not to mention, I mean, if you were going to go for a remorse thing, it's disrespect on top of murder, which it's disgusting. But it was framed as an attempt to somehow destroy the evidence or at least make an investigation harder for authorities. After the jury found them guilty on all counts, they were sentenced in December of 2000 to death. At the time of covering this, the Carr brothers remain incarcerated and are on death row in El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. This is the same place that Dennis Rader, known as the BTK killer, bind, torture, kill, responsible for at least 10 murders, is kept. In April of 2024, the brothers had their request for a new hearing denied. At this point, they had been behind bars for about 24 years. At the time of this latest court appearance, only Jonathan really chose to attend. They were aged 44 and 46 respectively. The request for a new hearing was based largely on the fact that some of their convictions, or at least the sentences, had been thrown out and challenged on the interim. Both brothers had attempted to pin the ultimate blame on one another. Jonathan's lawyer pointed to the fact that Reginald was older and held what he called a controlling influence over the younger Carr. The attorneys also used evidence that some members of the Wichita Police Department had been found to have exchanged messages that were considered racist, sexist, and homophobic, believing that this demonstrated an undue prejudice that affected the brothers' ability to receive fair treatment. One of the legal issues raised in the aftermath of their incarceration was that the two were not tried separately. When this was initially raised in 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned their death sentences but upheld their convictions. This was raised to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2016, which chose to overturn the decision and then send it back to the Kansas Supreme Court. At this second time of review, the final decision was that there were minor errors and oversights made in the original trial, but none of them were serious or egregious enough to warrant overturning their death sentence for a second time. The judge then referred back to the Kansas Supreme Court's decision that the brothers had received fair trials and there was no reason to overturn their death sentence. As of the time of writing, they are still sentenced to death. While the case caused an uproar when it was reported, some of the legal wrangling has resulted in a debate over the sentencing and the judicial processes of the trial of the Carr brothers. There are a few questions whether they were responsible. The discussions are primarily centered around whether it was truly appropriate for the two of them to be tried at the same time as equal partners in crime, although the lawyers for Jonathan have pointed out to the undue influence of the older brother Reginald. There remains doubt about exactly how much sway he truly had over him. The accusations of coercion and control, along with even some suggesting that there were instances of horizontal abuse inflicted on the younger brother Jonathan, are just wrinkles in the case that caused some commenters to have pause, while others are just less inclined to care. After all, influenced or not, the crimes that the two committed are extremely shocking. You cannot reintegrate somebody or two people like that back into society. When they do things like that, that runs pretty deep. I don't believe personally there's any coming back. Multiple counts of cold-blooded murder, along with robberies and horizontal assault, appears to be more than enough for most reasonable people to believe that the sentence of death is correct. In the aftermath of the spree, there was a significant uptick in the local area and beyond that of just citizens investing in security systems for their homes as well as guns, presumably for self-protection. As always, when it comes to tragic cases like these, the focus can tend to be on the culprits. After all, having people that are capable of committing acts of unspeakable violence like this within our society is a terrifying thought for most, but like I said, that's why you need to keep a countermeasure and stay strapped, because these people are out there. They're out there right now. It's just whether or not you've run into them is the biggest thing. Like, that's the thing. Do not delude yourself. Do not fool yourself. Monsters do live amongst us. And the problem is that I think a lot of like the way that we are heading kind of in general in society is we like to believe that everybody is, you know, fundamentally good and, you know, we can work through. There are people out there who are fundamentally bad, and really the only thing that fundamentally bad people are going to, I guess, respond to is absolute justice, in my personal opinion. But survivors like Andrew Shriver, who were robbed at gunpoint and helped identify the Carr brothers, Holly G, who suffered unimaginable horrors and had to see her friends and fiance brutalized and then taken out, and the families of the 5 victims who were left without people that they once loved and still do love. Heather Mueller had taught preschool at the time of her murder, and the school created an award named the Heather Mueller Love and Faith Award in her memory that is given out every year to a student. The family of Ann Walanta established a music scholarship at the university where she worked in her memory. It's hard to imagine that any who knew any of the victims will have much sympathy for what seems to amount to legal nitpicking when it comes to the legal process for the Carr brothers. And after basically having this video made on this, I have no sympathy for them either. The only regret I think that I have in reading this is they've been alive for 24 years. So there you have it. The Wichita Massacre, or what is known as the Wichita Horror, a story of brutal, wanton violence and the actions that ended multiple lives and committed 2 brothers to a lifetime behind bars who are also sentenced to death. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Obviously, this is a little more of a different thing than what we normally cover on this channel. Tell me your thoughts, and if you kind of like the concept of like these true crimes, or, you know, obviously I still want to cover cryptids and everything, but did you find this interesting to learn about? I mean, obviously it's a horrific event, but, you know, it's important, I think, that people know what's out there and not just in like, you can't bury your head when it comes to people like this. Otherwise, bad things could happen. So until next time, check out some of the other videos that I have for all things like mystery, creepy, and unexplained, as well as true crimes at this point. And I want to thank you guys for watching. If you want to like and subscribe, it gets the video out there and helps the channel grow, which is always appreciated. I also would like to thank my patrons real quick. At the Literal Wendigo tier, we have Brayley Hoover, Grayson West, and Stupid Fox. Thank you guys. At the Eyewitness to the Event tier, we have Beaver Malaga. At the First Hand Accounts tier, we have Pimp Daddy Shamrock and Yeeps. And at the Second Hand Accounts tier, we have Bianca, Fred Rush, and Troy. And to the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate y'all's support as well. It helps keep everything running smoothly, so thank you for that. But we're going to end that there. Thank you for watching, and I will see everyone in the next one.